Hi, it's Knuckle. Today I want to talk about a beautiful novel called The Namesake. I first heard of this novel in high school as some of the students were reading it for their research paper, and I had been resisting reading this novel ever since because it's by an American author of Indian descent and it's kind of epitomized as the Indian American novel, the novel that Americans of Desi descent have to read. And something within me always wanted to resist reading it just because I'm also an American of Indian origin. I started to become introduced to and intrigued by Indian and Pakistani writers in college because I was required to take at least one Anglophone literature class that wasn't focused solely on British or American literature. And that was where I discovered the beautiful literary gifts of contemporary South Asia. 3 years after graduating college, I read my favorite novel, The God of Small Things, which happens to be by an Indian author, Arundhati Roy. However, this time I've read a novel by an American of Desi descent, someone like me. And I decided to read it because of this hook in the jacket, where it says, with penetrating insight, Lahiri reveals not only the defining power of the names and expectations bestowed upon us by our parents, but also the means by which we slowly, sometimes painfully, come to define ourselves. I really, really loved that. The means by which we slowly, sometimes painfully, come to define ourselves. That's what this novel is about. It's about identity, not in the static sense in which we often think of cultural identity in particular. This novel showcases identity, including cultural identity, as something fluid, something ever changing, something shaped by those around you, by events that happen to you, by the places you've lived in. But identity is also something you have to figure out for yourself and shape out for yourself. No character in this novel has a static identity. Their identities are fluid and sometimes shaped in ways they never would have imagined or chosen. This novel was also very different from some of the novels I've been reading of late, and I loved it for how different it was. As I said earlier, my favorite novel is The God of Small Things, which is praised for inventing its own language. But The Namesake is almost the opposite. Lahiri is praised for having, quote, such direct, translucent prose that you almost forget you're reading. Just before reading this novel, I had finished Gabriel Garcia Marquez's A Hundred Years of Solitude, which is a magic realist work. So there's many characters in that novel who would really only exist in the literary space. And the namesake is the opposite. The characters are very, very real, and the things which happen to them are quite mundane. And yet there's so much emotional depth, even as she's describing seemingly superficial events in people's lives. The reader's attention is held throughout, and we're reminded that it's truly the small things in life that carry the most emotion for us. And maybe that is something this novel actually does have in common with The God of Small Things. I'm going to read through one passage and discuss it briefly, but I should warn you there's a bit of spoilers in this passage. So, this passage is coming at a point in the novel where Nikhil, or Gogol, the main character, is married to Mushimi. Both of them are Americans of Bengali descent, and this marriage is the first relationship either has had with another American of Indian descent. All of their prior relationships to this one had been with white characters. Mushimi and Nikhil both knew each other as children, as family friends, and their parents encouraged them to date because all the previous relationships had fallen apart. Now, Mushimi is at a place in the marriage where, for the first time, she's feeling perhaps a bit unsatisfied, and she's reflected on a previous relationship she'd had with a man named Graham. So, this is how the passage goes. She believed that he here is Nikhil, she believed that he would be incapable of hurting her as Graham had. After years of clandestine relationships, it felt refreshing to court in a fishbowl, to have the support of her parents from the very start, the inevitability of an unquestioned future, of marriage drawing them along. And yet, the familiarity that had once drawn her to him has begun to keep her at bay. Though she knows it's not his fault, she can't help but associate him, at times, with a sense of resignation, with the very life she had resisted, had struggled so mightily to leave behind. He was not who she saw herself ending up with. He had never been that person. Perhaps for those very reasons, in those early months, being with him, falling in love with him, doing precisely what had been expected of her for her entire life, had felt forbidden, wildly transgressive, a breach of her own instinctive will. Wow, this passage really gets to the heart of what the hook in the jacket was talking about. The means by which we slowly, sometimes painfully, come to define ourselves. The process of coming to define ourselves is not a one and done thing. It can't be rushed. It's a slow and sometimes painful process. And it involves having to deal not only with the expectations bestowed upon us by our parents, but also with the expectations we bestowed upon ourselves. This passage reveals so many of the great ironies of the human mind and human heart. So let's start at the beginning. She believed that he, Nikhil, would be incapable of hurting her as Graham had. And this is a source of dissatisfaction for Mushimi, that Nikhil is incapable of hurting her as Graham had. Mushimi might not have actually wanted to get hurt again, but she wants to know that her partner has a capability of hurting her as Graham had. This reminds me of something that the trauma specialist Gabor Mate says. He says, you will always marry someone that's going to trigger for you every unhappiness you ever had in your childhood. He says that when we find somebody to be in a relationship with, it happens on two levels. Quote, on one level, they're attractive, humorous, fun to be with. But underneath that, we're looking for a love that we never got in the first place. And this is what Mushimi is looking for, not just someone who would be capable of hurting her, but someone who would specifically be capable of hurting her as Graham had. She's looking for the kind of love she wasn't able to get in the first place. So there's some irony here. But let's read on. So after years of clandestine relationships, it felt refreshing to court in a fishbowl, to have the support of her parents from the very start, the inevitability of an unquestioned future, of marriage drawing them along. So after years implies a sense of exhaustion. She was exhausted with all the clandestine relationships she'd had. Clandestinity involves a certain degree of excitement, but at some point that excitement becomes boring and exhausting. And then it ironically becomes refreshing to do something more traditional. Because she's so used to and tired from having clandestine relationships, it now feels very different and new to her to do what might have otherwise seemed very vanilla. So again, there's some irony there. I really like to get married in a fishbowl or to court in a fishbowl, especially because we're talking about two people getting married in a fishbowl. I'm almost thinking of the fairy godparents from Fairly Odd Parents in that fishbowl. But there's a sense of security, of safety, of control, of fixed shape, right? There's a fixed shape to a fishbowl. It reminds me of in The Great Gatsby, it said that Daisy married Tom because she wanted her life to take some shape and form. And here, from the very start, the end is unquestionable. The start and the end together there. So again, you've got some irony and some polarity again. But now that she's in this fishbowl marriage, she's feeling the opposite. This was, after all, the kind of life she'd resisted her whole life. And she feels a sense of resignation to have ended up here. Nikhil was not who she saw herself ending up with. He had never been that person. So this is what I was talking about before when I said we have to grapple not only with the expectations set upon us by our parents, but with those we've set upon ourselves. And in the beginning, this is precisely what drew Nikhil to her. It felt forbidden to ease into the life she had tired herself with resisting. But now she looks upon it as resignation. So there's a conflict between wanting to resist the expectations bestowed upon her by her parents and wanting to break free from the exhausting expectations she set upon herself. What I love about this novel is a seamless and natural way in which it holds a magnifying glass to these very ordinary but very real stumbling blocks that we encounter at every stage in our lives. Wherever or whoever you are, I believe this novel has something in it for you.